The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. There's probably something in your life you keep putting off. Not because it doesn't matter, but because it just doesn't feel like the right time yet. A decision, a direction, a version of life that keeps showing up in your mind, but never actually turns into action. Maybe it's changing your job, starting something on your own, leaving something familiar, or finally doing something you've been thinking about for years. And every time you get close to it, something happens. Not outside, inside your mind. A familiar thought shows up. I'm not ready. And it doesn't feel irrational. It feels responsible, careful, even smart. So you pause. You wait. You prepare a little more. You think a little more. You tell yourself clarity will come later. But later never really comes. Weeks pass. Months pass. Sometimes years pass. And nothing really changes. Most people assume this is a confidence problem. They think, I just need to feel more certain. So they wait for a feeling that says, this is the right time. This is the right choice. You're finally ready. But what if that feeling never shows up? What if what you're waiting for doesn't actually exist the way you think it does? Because most people don't realize something important. The people who move forward aren't always confident. They're not always sure, and they definitely don't have all the answers. They just stopped waiting for certainty before they started. And that small shift changes everything. Most of us grow up believing something simple. If I prepare enough, I'll eventually feel ready. And in some areas of life, that's true. School works like that. Work often works like that. Skills improve like that. Do more, you get better. Practice more, you improve. Study more, you perform better. So we start applying that same logic to life decisions. We assume that if we think about something long enough, we'll eventually figure it out. But there's a hidden belief inside that idea, that uncertainty will eventually go away. If we just prepare long enough, think long enough, analyze long enough, we imagine there will be a moment where everything becomes clear, a moment where life suddenly feels simple, where the answer becomes obvious. But real life doesn't work like that, especially not with the decisions that actually matter. There is no moment where everything becomes completely clear. No internal signal that guarantees safety. No point where uncertainty fully disappears. And yet, we keep waiting for it. We call it readiness. But what we actually want is something deeper. We want certainty. We want to know that we won't regret it, that it will work out, that we're not making a mistake, that we're not stepping into something we can't handle. And that's completely human. Because uncertainty doesn't feel safe. The mind is designed to reduce uncertainty, to predict outcomes, to create control where there is none. So we start overthinking, planning more, researching more, replaying every possible outcome in our heads. At first, it feels productive. It feels responsible. It feels like progress. But slowly, something changes. Thinking stops helping you move forward and starts replacing the need to move at all. You start feeling like you're making progress without actually moving, because in your head, you're already living the decision. But in real life, nothing changes. And that creates an illusion. The illusion of preparation. You feel active, but your life stays still. And the longer this goes on, the more unfamiliar action starts to feel. Not because you can't act, but because you've trained yourself to stay in thinking instead of doing. And thinking feels safer, because thinking doesn't expose you to risk. You can control it. Pause it, rewind it, avoid it. But life doesn't respond to thinking. Life responds to action. And that's where the conflict begins. Part of you wants to move forward. Part of you wants certainty first. But certainty doesn't come first, and most of the time, it doesn't come the way you expect. It usually shows up later. Sometimes only after you've already moved into uncertainty. And that's why people stay stuck for so long. Not because they don't know what to do, but because they're waiting for something that was never meant to come first. If you look closely at your hesitation, it's not just fear of failure. It's something more subtle, something quieter. It's the need to know what will happen before you commit. Not just, will this work, but what am I going to lose if I do this? What will I become after this decision? What if I can't handle what comes next? And now the decision isn't just external anymore. It becomes internal, about who you are becoming. It's not just what you choose. It's who you become because of that choice. And that's where hesitation really lives. Imagine two people facing the same decision. Both feel fear. Both feel uncertainty. Both feel resistance. One moves forward. The other doesn't. Most people think the difference is confidence, but it usually isn't. The real difference is tolerance for uncertainty. Because at some point, the person who moves forward stops asking, "How do I make this safe?" and starts asking something harder. How long am I willing to stay here if nothing changes? That question changes everything internally, because now staying is no longer neutral. Staying is also a decision, and every decision has a cost. The cost of delay, the cost of staying the same, the cost of watching time pass without moving. And slowly, something becomes clear. The life you're afraid of stepping into isn't necessarily more dangerous. It's just unknown. But the life you're already in isn't actually stable either. It just feels familiar. And between those two, something starts to shift. Because eventually, the pain of staying the same becomes harder to ignore than the fear of change. And that's often where change begins. Not from clarity, but from buildup over time. A quiet realization. Staying here is also a decision. One of the strongest beliefs people have is this: I'll start when I feel confident. It sounds reasonable because confidence feels like something you should have before you begin. But psychological research shows something very different. One of the most influential psychologists of the last century, Albert Bandura, spent decades studying why some people take action while others stay stuck in self-doubt. And what he found was surprisingly simple. Confidence doesn't come first. It comes after experience. It grows through doing, through trying, through real experience, not through thinking about it. And this creates a gap most people get stuck in. They try to think their way into confidence. They prepare. They imagine outcomes. They simulate possibilities in their mind. They try to eliminate uncertainty before starting. But uncertainty doesn't disappear through thinking. It changes through experience. You don't become confident before you act. You become confident because you acted. At first, it feels uncomfortable, uncertain, imperfect, awkward, but those early experiences are exactly what build confidence later. Which means something important. The confidence you are waiting for does not exist before action. It is created by action. And that changes everything. Because now the question is no longer, how do I feel confident before I start? It becomes, what if confidence only shows up after I start? And if that's true, then waiting for confidence isn't preparation, it's delay. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're expecting the result before the experience that creates it. And that expectation is exactly what keeps so many people stuck at the edge of their own life. Preparation isn't the problem. In fact, sometimes it's necessary. It helps you improve. It helps you avoid obvious mistakes. It helps you move more wisely. But at some point, something shifts quietly. Preparation stops supporting action and starts replacing it. One more course, one more video, one more book, one more plan, one more adjustment. On the surface, it still feels like progress, but nothing actually changes. No real step is taken. No real risk is faced. And the mind is very good at this illusion. It creates activity without exposure, effort without risk, motion without change. And over time, this becomes a pattern. Because as long as you're preparing, you don't have to face uncertainty directly. You don't have to risk failure. You don't have to risk judgment. So preparation becomes safety, a controlled space where nothing can go wrong. But life doesn't respond to preparation alone. It responds to participation. Psychologists Paul Hewitt and Gordon Flett spent years studying perfectionism, and what they found surprised a lot of people. Perfectionism is often not really about high standards. It's about fear. Fear of failure. Fear of criticism. Fear of not being enough. And when that fear gets stronger, preparation stops being growth. It becomes protection. But here's the paradox. The more you try to protect yourself from uncertainty, the more you stay inside it. Because uncertainty doesn't disappear through planning. It only changes through experience. And this creates a loop. You prepare to feel safe. But preparation delays action. Delay creates anxiety. Anxiety creates more preparation, and the loop continues. Until eventually, you're no longer moving forward, just circling the idea of moving forward. And that's why so many people feel stuck. Not because they lack ability, but because the system they're using feels productive, even when it isn't. Breaking that loop requires something uncomfortable. Not more preparation, but interruption. A moment where you accept that risk can't be fully removed. Most people think procrastination is laziness. But that explanation is too simple, and most of the time, it isn't true. Procrastination researcher Timothy Pychyl has spent decades studying why people put things off, and his conclusion is surprisingly simple. Most procrastination is not really a time management problem. It's an emotional problem. Because when you look closely at what people avoid, it is rarely the task itself. It is the feeling attached to the task. People aren't avoiding work. They're avoiding feelings. Feelings like uncertainty, anxiety, self-doubt, fear of judgment, fear of failure. The task is just the trigger. The feeling is what they're trying to escape. The writer isn't avoiding writing. They're avoiding the possibility that what they create won't be good enough. The entrepreneur isn't avoiding starting. They're avoiding uncertainty and the discomfort of putting themselves out there. The person avoiding a difficult conversation isn't avoiding the conversation itself. They're avoiding what they might feel when the conversation finally happens. And once you see this clearly, something begins to shift. Because now you stop treating procrastination as a character flaw and start seeing it for what it really is, an attempt to avoid discomfort, even if that avoidance creates more discomfort later. And that's why the phrase, "I'm not ready," can be so convincing, because it sounds like a conclusion. But most of the time, it's a feeling disguised as a conclusion. Because it feels easier to say, "I'm not ready," than to say, "This scares me. This makes me uncomfortable. I don't know what will happen if I do this." But discomfort doesn't disappear just because we rename it. It stays. And the longer it is avoided, the heavier it becomes. Because what you avoid today rarely gets smaller tomorrow. Most of the time, it grows. And eventually, a different question begins to emerge. Which discomfort is harder to live with? The discomfort of uncertainty, or the discomfort of staying exactly where you are? For many people, that becomes the turning point. Not because fear disappears, but because staying the same starts to hurt more than moving forward. At first, it seems like fear is the problem. And yes, fear is part of it. Fear of failure, fear of uncertainty, fear of making mistakes. But underneath fear, there's something deeper. Change is not just about moving toward something new. It is also about leaving something familiar behind. Because when you change direction, you don't just change what you do. You change who you are becoming. And that's where the resistance gets stronger. Not because of what you have to do, but because of what it asks you to become. Because staying the same feels familiar, even if it's limiting, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it no longer fits your life. It's still known, and the mind often prefers unknown pain over an unknown possibility. Transition expert William Bridges argued that every major life transition begins with an ending. Something has to end before something new can begin. And those endings are rarely external, they are internal. Endings of identity, endings of self-image, endings of who you thought you were. That's why change can feel surprisingly heavy, because you're not just gaining something new, you're also being asked to let something go. The version of you that stayed safe, the version of you that avoided risk, the version of you that always waited for certainty. Even if that version no longer fits your life. Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung believed that real growth isn't about becoming someone else. It's about becoming more of who you already are, but haven't fully allowed yourself to be. And that process often feels like loss before it feels like growth. Because growth always asks for an exchange. Something new enters your life. But something old has to be left behind. And that's why waiting feels so tempting. Because waiting delays that confrontation. As long as you wait, you don't have to meet the version of yourself that exists on the other side of the decision. You don't have to find out what you're capable of. You don't have to discover who you become when certainty is no longer available. But eventually, that moment arrives, and you're left with only one real tension. Stay with what is familiar, or step into what is unknown. Most people keep asking the same question. Am I ready? Am I ready to change? Am I ready to start? Am I ready to take the risk? But that question rarely helps, because readiness doesn't come first. It comes through movement. Most people don't feel ready when they begin. They become ready because they began. And maybe that's what we misunderstand. We treat readiness as a requirement, when it's usually just a result. And if that's true, then waiting for readiness isn't preparation, it's postponement. Not because something is wrong with you, but because you're waiting for something that only appears after action. And maybe the people you admire weren't more ready than you. They were just less willing to wait for it. Not because they had certainty, not because they had guarantees, not because they had no fear, but because they accepted something uncomfortable. Uncertainty isn't something you solve before starting. It's something you carry while you move. So maybe the question is no longer, am I ready? Maybe it becomes, what am I willing to begin before I feel ready? Because the feeling you've been waiting for was never waiting for you at the finish line. It was waiting for you in the first step.